Here is Sailor Studio 280. This green has a heavy brown undertone. In fact, it can even at times look brown with green undertones, though it didn't show in the writing sample of the video. This can get some decent color variation on some papers, but the majority of the time it is a green with brown undertone. Even though the swatch looks much more brown, it does shade well, very well, all of the time. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it is a little aggressive, getting very deep into the paper, and unfortunately, it does feather a bit. The indecision of this ink is what makes it so good, showing most often as a green and shading to a nice brown.
The pen for today is an Namiki Emperor. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see that beautiful green that does shade to a nice brown, really showing off well on this very white paper. No feathering, no spread. The shading is easy to find. You don't have to figure what's going on when you look at figure on the first line, where the top of the F is lighter than the bottom of the F. That goes to a nice mid-tone. Lightens up into the I, gets darker during the G, U-R-E, at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Kinmokusai.
Here is Sailor Manyo Akibi. Here is Sailor Manyo Chigaya.
Here is Sailor Fire Red.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone of green is the same that we got on the Clairfontaine. However, it does not shade to show the brown undertones of this ink. Otherwise, it has no feathering, no spread, and it does shade well, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. So in conclusion, if you look at conclusion, the C and beginning of O is a nice mid-tone. The O and CL are a bit lighter. The Usian at the end does get quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting's not really too much of a problem, though there are a few points that it does get a little deeper into the page. I don't think these points really would stop you from using the back of the page if this was the ink you were using. And in fact, these points are so light, they did not touch the page underneath.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get a slightly brighter green than we had on the Clairfontaine, not showing any of those brown undertones in this case. No feathering, no spread. The translucency of this ink shows that it's being altered just a little bit by the tone of the paper, which is the reason it becomes a little bit brighter of a green. Now, it does shade, not as a huge standout feature. We can see some of that shading going on in integers on the second line, where in is lighter. The teg is a bit darker. The ers at the end, just a little bit lighter than that TEG was. Looking at the back of the page, we see a few spots where the ink did get quite a bit deeper into the page. So you might have to make a choice about whether to use it. I don't think this would stop you from using the back of this page, but there is a fair amount of ghosting happening. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see that we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It shades well. I don't think it shades as well as it did even on some of the non-fountain pen friendly paper. It does stand out against this quad rule without any kind of a problem, allowing the quad rule to really melt into the background and not be a part of your writing. This is a good choice, I think, if this is the type of paper you go for. Looking at the back of the page. Now, nothing bled through touching the page underneath, but I am going to go ahead and mark and show you some spots where the ink got a bit deeper into the page. This is a coated paper, so this should not be a normal thing to happen. It's just kind of a warning sign to be aware of here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks.
Here is Colorverse 39 Supernatural for the Opus 88 Picnic Green. Here is Cross Green. Here is Diatramentis Pine Green.
Here is Pannonia, Golden Zold Pelican.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely shades. Yes, there's shading, but I'm going to call it barely shading only because of the amount of shade that we saw on other papers. You can easily find the shading that's going on here. Look at therefore on the first line where the H, second E, RE at the end, bottom of the F, all are a bit darker. So it's definitely there, nowhere near as stand out. Still doing well to stand itself out against the quad rule. Still would be a good ink to use if you're a student. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Krishna Orange. Here is Noodler's Kung Ticheng.
Here is Twisby Black.
Here is Lamy Red.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone we're getting is just a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather. It does have tiny feathers. The tiny feathers aren't so distracting that you wouldn't use it, but they are present. And this particular paper I've been using is not really the problem when it comes to feathering. Normally, it does have that normal amount of spread that you would expect on 20-pound copy paper, and it does shade slightly. So the shading is present. Looking at the back of the page, you see that this does get quite deep into the paper pretty regularly, meaning I probably would not use the back of the page for writing as well. It would be a one-side use only. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Namiki Emperor has a nice wet medium fine nib and gives very nice shading throughout the writing sample. Now off camera, I use this in a very wet medium nib to see the brown shading down to green, which it is exactly what it did. I also tried a dry fine, and while the shading stayed, it was no longer shading to a brown, sacrificing the great feature of this ink. Now, I love green shading inks to brown from the wet fine, so I would suggest going with a wet medium, but not a gusher of a wet pen.